one last set of readings for this week. And I'm going to read from multiple sources, actually. So you should be able to see on your screen the words that I'm reading to you, and be able to read along, hopefully, with me, just like I've done the last several. But it's going to be multiple sources instead of just one. Okay? So a couple of quick things. The first source that I'm going to read to you from is this book right here, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. Looks like it's reversed. Anyways, it was written in 1852, originally written in 1852 and published by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was an abolitionist from the North. And she wanted to record her opinions basically about slavery and how she felt about it, really painting slave owners as vicious and unfeeling, brutal, all of the negative things that we all pretty much know about slavery. When the book came out and was published, it led a lot of people in the North to see slavery kind of for the first time through her eyes. And it led to a lot more negative backlash against the South. So there is a rumor that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of the book, he looked at her and he said, "So you're the little lady who started this great war." Basically putting it at her feet that she published this book, and the reactions to it were very polarizing at the time. In the South, they looked at it and said, "This is not even true. This is not how slavery works. This isn't what we do to our slaves." And in the North, they looked at it and they said, "Oh my gosh, every slave owner obviously is a brutal, sadistic jerk," right? Or stronger than that, but you get my point. So a couple of things before I get into the reading of it. In the original language, and you can see it on the screen here, the use of the N-word is pretty prevalent. And you'll see that if you look at primary sources from the time, there is a lot of use of that word. Clearly, I don't condone the use of the N-word for any reason. I won't actually say it out loud. I will replace that word with the word slave because I feel uncomfortable using that word. If we were in the classroom, I'd be giving you the same spiel. And so just keep in mind, it's not a word that you should have as part of your, normal everyday vocabulary. And we'll just leave it at that. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. This is from the first chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm not reading you the entire book because it's fairly lengthy. This is just to give you a sense of, a Northern abolitionist view of slavery. It is a primary source because it was originally published in 1852, but it is fictional, right? These are not real people that she's talking about. She's just giving you a fictional look at what Miss Stowe, right, Harriet Beecher Stowe, what she saw as the way that slavery went, okay? So here we go. Mrs. Shelby had gone on her visit, and Eliza stood in the veranda, rather dejectedly looking after the retreating carriage, when a hand was laid on her shoulder. She turned, and a bright smile lighted up her fine eyes. "George, is it you? How you frightened me! Well, I'm so glad you's come. Missus is gone to spend the afternoon, so come into my little room, and we'll have the time all to ourselves." Saying this, she drew him into a neat little apartment opening on the veranda, where she generally sat at her sewing within call of her mistress. "How glad I am! Why don't you smile? And look at Harry, how he grows." The boy stood shyly regarding his father through his curls, holding close to the skirts of his mother's dress. "Isn't he beautiful?" said Eliza, lifting his long curls and kissing him. "I wish he'd never been born," said George bitterly. "I wish I'd never been born myself." Surprised and frightened, Eliza sat down, leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, and burst into tears. "There now, Eliza, it's too bad for me to make you feel so, poor girl," he said fondly. "It's too bad. Oh, how I wish you never had seen me. You might have been happy." George, how can you talk so? What dreadful thing has happened or is going to happen? I'm sure we've been very happy till lately." "So we have, dear," said George, then drawing his child on his knee, he gazed intently on his glorious dark eyes and passed his hands through his long curls. "Just like you, Eliza, and you are the handsomest woman I ever saw, and the best one I ever wished to see. But oh, I wish I'd never seen you, nor you me." "Oh, George, how can you?" "Yes, Eliza, it's all misery, misery. Misery! My life is bitter as wormwood. The very life is burning out of me. I'm a poor, miserable, forlorn drudge. I shall only drag you down with me, that's all. What's the use of our trying to do anything, trying to know anything, trying to be anything? What's the use of living? I wish I was dead. Oh, now, dear George, that really is wicked. I know how you feel about losing your place in the factory, and you've had a hard master, but pray be patient, and perhaps something. Patient? Said he, interrupting her. Haven't I been patient? Did I say a word when he came and took me away for no earthly reason from the place where everybody was kind to me? I'd paid him truly every cent of my earnings, and they all say I worked well. Well, he's dreadful, said Eliza, but after all, he is your master, you know. My master! And who made him my master? That's what I think of. What right has he to me? I'm a man as much as he is. I'm a better man than he is. I know more about business than he does. I'm a better manager than he is. I can read better than he can. I can write a better hand. And I've learned it all myself, and no thanks to him. I've learned it in spite of him. And now what right has he to make a dray horse of me? Take me from things I can do, and do better than he can, and put me to work that any horse can do. He tries to do it. He says he'll bring me down and humble me, and he puts me to just the hardest, meanest, and dirtiest work on purpose. Oh, George, George, you frighten me. Why, I never heard you talk so. I'm afraid you'll do something dreadful. I don't wonder at your feelings at all, but oh, do be careful, do, for my sake, for Harry's. I have been careful, and I have been patient. But it's growing worse and worse. Flesh and blood can't bear it any longer. Every chance he can get to insult and torment me, he takes. I thought I could do my work well and keep on quiet and have some time to read and learn out of work hours. But the more he sees I can do, the more he loads on. He says that though I don't say anything, he sees I got the devil in me and he means to bring it out. And one of these days it will come out in a way he won't like, or I'm mistaken. Oh dear, what shall we do? Said Eliza mournfully. It was only yesterday, said George, as I was busy loading stones into a cart, that young Massa Tom stood there slashing his whip so near the horse that the creature was frightened. I asked him to stop as pleasant as I could. He just kept right on. I begged him again, and then he turned on me and began striking me. I held his hand, and then he screamed and kicked and ran to his father and told him that I was fighting him. He came in a rage and said he'd teach me who was my master, and he tied me to a tree and cut switches for young Master Tom and told him that he might whip me till he was tired. And he did do it. If I don't make him remember it some time. And the brow of the young man grew dark, and his eyes burned with an expression that made his young wife tremble. Who made this man my master? That's what I want to know, he said. Well, said Eliza mournfully, I always thought that I must obey my master and mistress, or I couldn't be a Christian. There is some sense in it in your case. They've brought you up like a child, fed you, clothed you, indulged you, and taught you, so that you have a good education. That is some reason why they should claim you. But I've been kicked and cuffed and sworn at, and at the best only let alone. And what do I owe? I paid for all my keeping 100 times over. I won't bear it. No, I won't, he said, clenching his hand with a fierce frown. Eliza trembled and was silent. She'd never seen her husband in this mood before, and her gentle system of ethics seemed to bend like a reed in the surges of such passions. You know poor little Carlo that you gave me? Added George. The creature's been about all the comfort I've had. He slept with me nights and followed me round days and kind of looked at me as if he understood how I felt. Well, the other day I was just feeding him with a few old scraps I picked up by the kitchen door, and Master came along and said I was feeding him up at his expense, and that he couldn't afford to have every slave keeping his dog, and ordered me to tie a stone to his neck and throw him in the pond. Oh, George, you didn't do it? Do it? Not I, but he did. Master and Tom pelted the poor drowning creature with stones, poor thing. He looked at me so mournful, as if he wondered why I didn't save him. I had to take a flogging, because I wouldn't do it myself. I don't care. Master'll find out that I'm one that whipping won't tame. My day will come yet if he don't look out. What are you going to do? Oh, George, don't do anything wicked. If you only trust in God and try to do what's right, he'll deliver you. I ain't a Christian like you, Eliza. My heart's full of bitterness. I can't trust in God. Why does he let things be so? Oh, George, we must have faith. Mistress says that when all things go wrong to us, we must believe that God is doing the very best. That's easy to say for people that are sitting on their sofas and riding in their carriages. But let 'em be where I am. I guess it would come some harder. I wish I could be good, but my heart burns and can't be reconciled anyhow. You couldn't in my place. You can't now. If I tell you all I got to say, you don't know the whole yet. What can be coming now? Well, lately, Massa been saying that he was a fool to let me marry off the place. That he hates Mr. Shelby and all his tribe because they're proud and hold their heads up above him, and that I got proud notions from you. And he says he won't let me come here any more, and that I shall take a wife and settle down on his place. At first, he only scolded and grumbled these things, but yesterday he told me that I should take Mina for a wife and settle down in a cabin with her, or he'd sell me down river. But you were married to me. Prime Minister, as much as you've been married, as much as you've been a white man, said Eliza simply. Don't you know a slave can't be married? There's no law in this country for that. I can't hold you for my wife if he chooses to part us. That's why I wish I'd never seen you. Why should I'd never been born? It would have been better for us both. It would have been better for this poor child if he'd never been born. All this may happen to him yet. Oh, but Master's so kind. Yes, but who knows? He may die, and then he may be sold to nobody knows who. What pleasure is it that he is handsome and smart and bright? I tell you, Eliza, that a sword will pierce through your soul for every good and pleasant thing that your child is or has. It will make him worth too much for you to keep. The words smote heavily on Eliza's heart. The vision of the traitor came before her eyes, and as if someone had struck her a deadly blow, she turned pale and gasped for breath. She looked nervously out on the veranda, where the boy, tired of the grave conversation, had retired, and where he was riding triumphantly up and down on Mr. Shelby's walking stick. She would have spoken to tell her husband her fears, but checked herself. Okay, before I move on to the next section here, just a couple of things that were in this passage that I want to point out. One, it's obvious that Eliza and George, they're married, quote unquote married, but they live on different plantations and have different masters. Eliza is a house slave. She clearly comes or works for a family that is nice to her. They've treated her well. She has her own room. She was actually sad watching the carriage go. If you caught that at the beginning, she was watching her master and mistress go off in the carriage, and she looked dejectedly at them, meaning she was sad to see them go. She talks kindly about them. They raised her up like they were their own child. They let her learn how to read and write, right? They teach her how to be a, quote, good Christian. George, on the other hand, works for a very vile master, which is pretty clear. The master let his son beat George, whip him with a switch, which is just a bendy part of a tree branch, basically, for things that the kid is responsible for, right? In addition, he drowned George's dog, made him watch as the dog drowned in the pond. So a pretty awful person. So a couple of things to point out with that. Even though Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist and her point in writing the book was to point out the evils of slavery, even she still points out that not all slaves were treated terribly. And that's important to recognize, right? If this is a primary source and we're looking at how slaves were treated, even abolitionists are able to admit that not all slaves had the same experience. So I just want to point that out again. I talked about it last week, I think, and you'll see it again in some of the other sources I read today, but just be aware, okay? The other thing that was in this segment that I just read to you is the fact that George worked for a factory. So some slaves, if they had, if they were really skilled at something, they could take on jobs and actually get paid for those jobs. And then it was up to the master to decide what he was going to do with that money. Some slaves were allowed to keep it. They could save up. They could buy their own freedom. In this case, though, George's master, being the awful person that he was, he took all of George's earnings. So not only was George a slave on the plantation of his master, but he worked at a factory, got paid for that work, and had to give those wages to his master as well. So those are some of the things that you could kind of take away from this section. The treatment of slaves, if that was something you were thinking of doing for your project, your art project, there are some pieces in there that you could use. Eliza is a house slave. So they kind of mentioned some of the things that she would do. She would do her sewing, right? She'd be there at the call of her mistress. And again, treat it better than George was. in terms of their daily treatment, right? George is a field slave who also works at a factory. Okay. If you have any questions, guys, you're watching this and you're like, hey, I'm wondering about that, just post comments in the Google Classroom. If you want it to be a private comment, you just for you and me, that's fine. But if you want it to be public, just post it as a general class comment, and that way other students can maybe benefit